Our speaker will be introduced by Trey Evans, class of 2006. Trey is the incoming president for the San Antonio Alumni Chapter. A computer science major, Trey now works for USAA. Trey?
Good afternoon, everyone. I was asked to introduce Dr. Keesha Middlemass. She's currently one of our assistant professors in the Department of Political Science, and her research interests meet at the intersection of race, institutions, and public policy. She'll tie that into her talk today. She co-edited Racializing Justice, which explores mass incarceration, and has authored a manuscript that's currently under publication, utilizing her research to link felony conviction to social disability. Dr. Middlemass is a former Mellon Fellow at the Vera Institute of Justice and a former American Political Science Association Fellow, a Congressional Fellow. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Keesha Middlemass. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Is my excellent. Making sure all the technological pieces are in place. So Trey, thank you very much for the warm welcome. President Michael, thank you for, thank you for making time in your schedule. Totally appreciate it. So today I'm going to talk about marijuana legalization and literally how it is changing the politics of our federal government, our federal system, and thinking about how literally marijuana, weed, Mary Jane, ganja, grass, pot, reefer, pick your preference in terms of words, but it literally has changed how we talk about federal-state relationships. So if you think about the worldwide drug industry, it's approximately $350 billion. And I say approximately because a lot of it is illicit. We don't know the underground and efforts of actually how much people make from it. So these are just broad estimates. But the idea is to sort of contextualize what the federal government does and then what states are doing in response. So what is going around right now, because an important part of this conversation is the power of Congress to set the legalization standards. So your handout that you were just given now is really the schedules of drugs. So drugs are scheduled in 5 different degrees and variation of the harshest are in Schedule 1 all the way down to Robitussin in Schedule 5. All of these are regulated. Where you will find is that marijuana is a Schedule 1 drug along with heroin. And so the idea is to sort of contextualize why did this happen and now why are the states responding in the way they're doing so. So first, to contextualize some terminologies to make sure we're all on the same page, I'll talk about federalism, the criminal code in our federal system, and then the federal schedule of drugs. This idea of federalism, of course, we live under a system where states have independent powers, and then the federal government has independent powers, and some of it is shared, like taxes, but then some of it is not shared, so they have literally separate systems. So we have a federal criminal code, we have a state criminal code, and they differ. In the entire criminal code of the United States, there's 10 or 11 different ways to kill another person, and the definitions vary. So I'm talking about a wide variance of how we contextualize crime, who is a criminal, the distribution of sort of personal responsibilities, and how that then factors into drug laws. In terms of the federal drug schedule, marijuana became that way because of Nixon. Nixon had a problem with folks getting high on the National Mall and sort of encouraged Congress then to regulate it and criminalize it. In order to figure out how did Nixon do that and then to get to this moment in time now, I'm going to give you a brief, broad overview of literally the history of drugs in this country. So like, for instance, cocaine. It was an active ingredient in Coca-Cola. The caffeine stayed in it, and the cocaine was removed in about 1903. Opium. Opium has been used to treat a whole bunch of diseases, and literally doctors hailed it as a treatment for whatever condition ails the patient. So literally, opium, smoke it, inject it, snort it, it will fix whatever ails you. This is what doctors were saying at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. Morphine, which is a derivative of opium, was manufactured during the Civil War and was in wide use by the time we got to the Civil War. So you think about painkillers. World War II was really, really good. Successful, bad, successful, however you want to manage it, about creating new drugs. So you think about methamphetamines, which is also known as crack, crank, ice. These are sort of the derogatory terms. But methamphetamines were given to Japanese kamikaze pilots so they could actually literally fly the whole way. They were used on our side to make sure soldiers could stay awake. We think about the German doctors were cut off from methamphetamines at one time during the war, so they created methadone, which was a replacement of a painkiller so they could treat injured soldiers. And then we come to cannabis. So cannabis, marijuana, cannabis is the actual marijuana plant. It was cultivated in China, Taiwan, Turkey, Egypt, Lebanon, India, long traditions of cannabis use. And literally, growing of marijuana was not a problem in these areas, and it sort of then grew a little bit, and then of course transitioned into Europe, and then of course came to the United States. Hashish, which is a derivative of the mature female plant of the cannabis plant. So literally, think about like pollen from female cannabis plants, then create hashish. So these are different forms of drugs. If you think about literally the idea of cannabis in the United States, marijuana in the United States, it was not regulated until about the 1940s. So literally marijuana was the sort of the last drug that the federal government really sort of stepped into to deal with, generally around demographic changes. So it was okay when the elites and the rich would get drunk, use drugs, but when that then trickled down to the masses, you started having problems. So you can think about the temperance movement and alcohol. So the same kind of movement was then trying to regulate the actual idea of prohibiting drugs. They were effective, of course, getting the prohibition of alcohol in the amendment 18th Amendment in 1920, and then of course that was repealed. So no one ever tried to do that with drugs, so Congress did it through legislation. And the idea is that if it's regulated, controlled, there will be less problems. As we know today, that is not the case. Sort of the iron law of drugs is if you regulate it more, if you control it more, it'll go underground and people will literally learn how to grow better marijuana in their basements. Because now it's a controlled environment. So if you're a planter, a farmer, you understand if you have a controlled environment, you can grow a better corn or a better wheat. You don't have to deal with bugs. You can literally grow better weed inside. And our regulations have done that in a lot of areas of this country until states started then literally trying to fight against this. So some states were doing it in a small, sort of piecemeal fashion. And then in the last recent 5 or 6 years, it has totally exploded. But before we got to this explosion, you got to think about how marijuana was criminalized by Nixon. Nixon was elected the first time in 1968. He took office in January of 1969, and he gave a major speech to Congress in July of 1969. And the backstory is that he was looking out of the White House. He just moved in, was sort of first-time president, getting to know the White House, and he looked across the street to Lafayette Square Park. So if you've ever been to DC, there's this beautiful traditional park. There's a couple of churches around the area. But he saw a lot of college-age kids, mostly white kids, getting high. And he was bothered by it. And he started calling them the radicals, and they're dangerous, and people fly into a rage if they get high. Congress, you must do something. So he commissioned the Schaefer Commission to sort of investigate what's going on with drugs. Why are people doing this? How can we set the stage to get these individuals off my beautiful park that's sort of literally on the other side of the White House fence? It's a serious national threat, and we must do something about it. Schaefer Commission started investigating. Doctors, healthcare workers, former addicts. They literally had a large group of people giving testimony about the effects of particular marijuana, but other drugs. So if you look on the schedules, it's sort of the schedule. Heroin is up at the top. Cocaine is Schedule 2. Marijuana got into the Schedule 1 because Nixon was basically mad. He wanted a straight-laced society. He thought there was too many drug users raising hell on the National Mall. It looked bad when we're trying to fight in Vietnam, and literally these people are corrupting the national image. So you think about Nixon encouraging Congress to pass the Controlled Substance Act, making it more dangerous than other drugs. Under Nixon, the DEA in 1973 was created. So then we started doing these interdiction efforts in different countries. What we effectively did is, instead of marijuana being grown in Mexico, we destroyed the grow in Mexico, and we just pushed it into Colombia. There's now recent studies coming in about all our sort of war on drugs in an international environment. Being in Afghanistan, we're rebuilding roads, we're doing irrigation systems, and now the poppy growers have a more effective system to get the opium to the major capital cities, thanks to the ingenious efforts of our federal government. So it's sort of like this idea, it's whack-a-mole. You put out one problem and we sort of produce another. What Nixon set in place was this harder crackdown, and Congress agreed. So you think about the crack cocaine epidemic in the 1980s. Harsh, tough penalties. We incarcerated a lot of people for nonviolent drug use. You think about then the idea of criminalizing one type of cocaine. So crack cocaine and regular powder cocaine are very similar, but we cracked down on black people using crack cocaine because of the violence related to it. We did not crack down on white users of powder cocaine because it's a different type of market. It does not have the same violence. And then if you think about OxyContin, it is now a health issue. It is not a drug addiction, it's a health issue because OxyContin is prescribed by doctors. It doesn't matter if you have 60 prescriptions and you're going to pill manufacturers across state lines. You're literally now reintroducing this illegal drug use, but when black people use cocaine, it's a criminalization issue, it's a crime issue. When white people use OxyContin and overdose or become little drug dealers, but it's prescribed pills, it's a health issue. Marijuana falls into this weird space then, so I wanted to sort of contextualize how we treat other drugs. Marijuana is this weird thing in the sense that the political calculus is totally changing. It is totally changing. So we have these political debates. Drugs are bad. Nancy Reagan, don't do drugs. We have a lot of investment in the federal system and states. So for instance, when you think about just the criminalization of drugs, Texas, make sure I don't give you false numbers here. Texas spends about $3.1 billion on the criminal justice system a year. That includes prisons, corrections, parole administration, victim services, officer training. Does not include building prisons. So $3.1 billion a year in Texas, just on criminalization, arrests, prosecutions. In comparison, New Jersey, I know it's a smaller state in terms of size and population, but they spend $1 billion and it's decreasing just because they've treated drugs a different way than Texas has. When you think about the money we invest in convicting drug crimes and Texas being literally in the bottom five states, on how much money we spend in per pupil for public education. We're sort of spending a lot on criminal justice and a little on public education, and there's lots of studies that show the connection, that lack of education, more criminal activity. It's the side note of the cost of how much we invest in this particular system of regulating drugs. If we think about the war on drugs and then the tough on crime political rhetoric, we're now in this quasi-legal state of marijuana, depending on your jurisdiction, depending on where you live, depending on the politics of your states. And it is not a red state, blue state, it's not even a purple state issue. I'm really talking about a political issue that does not have a clear political stance. Republicans are looking at the taxes and like, oh right, I don't have to raise taxes on homeowners. I don't have to raise taxes on sales taxes. I should tax weed at 30% and everybody's okay with that. Oh my goodness. Democrats are thinking all these social services they can pay for and they don't have to then do new taxes and have to negotiate with Republicans. So it's sort of a win-win in a certain respect for both sides of the political spectrum. But there's the problem of the federal law on Schedule 1. Marijuana says it's illegal. Federal law still mandates that it is illegal. So literally we have now a states' rights issue around marijuana. And in our federal system, states do have the responsibility to police and enforce criminal law, to sort of look at the public morals, the public order, education at the local level. That is clear in the 10th Amendment. Concerning drug laws, we've got this overlap. So we got the federal laws and then we've got state laws, and the state laws literally are ignoring the federal laws. They're creating their own system. We have, in terms of public policy, never quite seen things this way. Normally it's top down. The federal government sets standards and then states will either adopt some of those standards and then ignore some of the other ones, but sort of the federal government sets the standards. In marijuana policy, the federal government has set the standards and the states have said, and who cares? We can do our own thing. So in terms of this whole idea of marijuana and legalization, there's three big terms. So there's legalization, literally making personal use for those 21 and over fair game. You can grow up to, depending on the state again, you can have 4 of your own plants. You can possess up to 3 ounces and not be criminalized. You can get high in public. And if now they're treating it sort of like DUIs in terms of driving. So when you think about legalization, it's literally making small amounts in your personal possession legal under state law. So they're changing the criminal code. When we think about decriminalization, that is changing the crime code, the criminal code, in terms of adopting reduced penalties. So right now we have really harsh penalties for any possession. But now some places, some states are treating it almost like a traffic ticket or a civil order. So you're paying penalties, you're doing community service. It is not a crime issue in a lot of cities and a lot of states. They're literally decriminalizing it. The other side is then also medicinal marijuana. And that is a whole purpose of allowing individuals based on a doctor's recommendation and prescription to then treat medicinal marijuana as a non-criminal issue. So it's possession, cultivation, use is not a criminal issue because it's then a medical issue. California was the first state to make medicinal marijuana legal. And that was a big controversial issue. So this was 1996. The DEA would then raid, and the FBI would raid these medical dispensaries in California. They would take all their money, they would take all the pot, they would sort of destroy the business side. And then California would say, well, we'll help you now rebuild. We have legalized it, we will help you rebuild. Forget the DEA and the FBI, we will help you rebuild. We'll try to figure out how to do this and protect you. So California, as it is in most policies, particularly on the liberal progressive side, California goes first, and all the other states sort of watch what's going on in California. How did the federal government respond? Many states now have literally looked at California and started to either decriminalize and scale back the penalties, or they're moving towards total legalization. In some instances, it's almost easier to talk about the states that are doing nothing, because there are so many states that are doing either medicinal decriminalization, legalization, or all three. So the states that are doing nothing: Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Tennessee, Utah, Virginia, and Wyoming. Every other state is doing something. Even Texas is talking about introducing a medicinal marijuana bill this session. Who knew? Who knew? Why states are thinking about this is usually about the issue of taxation. So an article just came out today in Huffington Post. Colorado, in the first full year of legalization, brought in $50 million worth of tax proceeds. $50 million, just new revenue. We didn't have to go after homeowners. Colorado state legislators did not have to go after an increased sales tax. All of a sudden, schools now have a whole bunch of technology. And the state literally has the predicament of sending money back to their constituents because of the state constitution saying, well, you've only allowed to take in this much, and once you go over that level, you got to send it back to the residents. Republicans are like, no, we're not giving a tax break. This is marijuana. We can't support a tax break for marijuana. Democrats are like, oh, send it back. But politically, Politically, no elected official wants to send money back, even whatever the Constitution says. So this idea of, it started with medicinal marijuana. So California was the first. Washington State then removed the issue of criminal penalties and created medicinal marijuana in 1998. And now we've got several states that have legalized medical marijuana and are in various stages of implementing it. When I say various states, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Montana, Hawaii, Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan, New York, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. So when I say it's easier to talk about the states doing nothing, it is much easier to talk about the states doing nothing. Medicinal marijuana and the legalization of medicinal marijuana is generally now we're seeing as the first step to legalization. Because when you create medicinal marijuana, you have now a regulatory system. You know who the doctors are, you know who the grows are, you have a tax system, you have people register, they get licenses. It's like this whole regulatory system. So those states that have decriminalized are now moving towards legalization at a much quicker pace than other states. So Washington State, as I mentioned, followed California in 1998, created medicinal marijuana. In 2012, they then created a legalization law, and they tax it at 25%. They tax the producer, they tax the process, so the packaging, and they tax it at the retail level, and each time it's 25%. Yeah. You're talking about each quarter bringing in $10 or $12 million each quarter. So those over age 21 can legally smoke weed. They can possess small amounts in Washington State. Colorado looked at Washington State and says, we can do that better. We'll take you one step further. Colorado did not have medicinal marijuana. They just went for the whole thing right off the bat. Let's legalize. Let's not take this marginal step. Let's just legalize. So some estimates that Colorado literally legalized it. They have now moved into a new system where they are now looking at how to create a banking system. So I'm going to come back to the banking system because federal law is problematic with illegal proceeds based on federal law. So we'll come back to banking in a minute. But Colorado literally looked at the benefits financially and resource benefits of decriminalizing marijuana. They investigated it. They thought, well, we'll regulate it like tobacco and alcohol. What does that look like? How do we do this? So they estimated how they were going to do it. They put it to the voters. The voters said, sure. And then they went back to the voters and said, can we tax it at 15%? Because of Colorado's constitution, they have to ask permission to the voters for taxes. Colorado voters said, sure, 15% is fine. A year later, the state came back and said, by the way, that 15% will go to schools, but can we, the state, get 10% on top of the 15%? And voters said, sure. So we're already at 25%. And then the state went back a second time and like, we need a little bit of money for the regulatory apparatus to make it legal. So can we get 2.9%? The voters said, sure. So Colorado taxes marijuana at 27.9%. The voters said it was okay. What else can we tax at 27.9% and voters approve it and will willingly do it? And then get $50 million worth of state income. The challenge now with Colorado, as I mentioned before, is their banking. So under federal law, banks cannot proceed illegal gains because they can be charged with money laundering. They can be charged with racketeering. They can be charged with aiding and abetting felons, even if someone has not been convicted of a felony. Sort of, you're aiding and abetting criminals. Federal law states that banks cannot use money from ill-gotten gains. And so banks are routinely rejecting the profits from marijuana grows and marijuana retail businesses. And federal banking laws, because they literally have not changed the laws, the Treasury Department has come back and said, you know what, under certain circumstances, so if your state has said it's legal, you can take in those proceeds. Yeah, a memo from the United States Treasury with a new election in the presidential election in 2016 probably does not mean a lot. We don't know who the next Treasury Secretary will be. So a lot of banks are like, thanks for the memo. No, we're not going to take this money. We don't know what you'll do. You may still prosecute us. You may still take our bank charter. So it's really become a cash business, which then creates a secondary potential criminal market, because now you've got cash business and now criminals know where the cash is because you have advertisement like, come and get weed. There's so all these multiple things. So Colorado is so interesting because it is now creating a credit union for weed growers and weed businesses. Literally a credit union only based in the state to get around federal laws. And Colorado said, we're doing this. We love the income stream. So let's figure out how we're going to keep the money in Colorado. So the state of Colorado has created a credit union for weed. It is, I know, it's hilarious. Like the sort of the idea of it is hilarious in my idea. But creating a credit union for weed profits legalizes and institutionalizes marijuana and the legality of marijuana, at least in the state of Colorado. So every time there's a new law that puts a piece of the institutional apparatus in place, that now makes it a little bit more permanent. And if you study American politics, is once something is in a building, is in the law, it is very, very hard to change. It is almost harder to change the law once it's on the books. So Colorado has legalized marijuana. It is now in the process of creating a credit union. And a credit union is not just about banking, but it's allowing having credit card access. It's allowed to be taking checks. It's allowed to pay your bills, because you can't go, this is the state legislature. A lot of the marijuana producers and retailers were showing up at the Capitol to pay their taxes with boxes of money that smelled like weed. And legislators were sort of like, this is not a good program. Now we got to count your money, and now it smells. So then the profits then started being sprayed with air freshener. Like, this is the way people were like, exactly, it's kind of hilarious. So people were trying to really like, we have legal money. Please take our money. We want to be good businesses. We want you to allow us to deposit our profits. And guess what? If you deposit our profits, you can audit us like a regular business. You can regulate us. You can now figure out where the taxes are coming from. You can literally treat us like a regular business. And Colorado, literally politicians are like, we have to figure this out. So in this process of doing a credit union, it'll be interesting how the Treasury Department responds, because even credit unions have to be approved by the federal banking system. They have certain charters. So some credit unions, I have been told, are accepting money, just not advertising it. They're accepting drug profits, but just not advertising it. They're sort of like, if the money's here and the federal government wants to take this drug profits, illegal gains based on federal law, well, then they're going to have to come and get it. And that is literally what the states are telling the federal government. If you want to stop this, you must now come and get it. Like, you must now go into all the states that I mentioned and come and literally take the money and make everybody into criminals. So Colorado, as I mentioned, interesting. Oregon is also another interesting state. So Oregon, Alaska, and the Washington, D.C., just in this past November, legalized marijuana. You're sort of like, D.C., you do know Congress regulates everything you do. So think about sort of not just federalism, but the District of Columbia voted to legalize marijuana. Who knows what Congress will do? And Congress has the power to, and the ultimate jurisdiction to figure out what to do. But the city council is already sort of moving ahead and forming a regulatory system for taxation. They're following Colorado's lead. They're following California's lead as to what does this regulation look like? Do we do it through the Alcohol Beverage Regulation Administration, or do we set up a weed regulation, which is kind of weird? They probably will call it marijuana. They won't use the slang weed. But the idea is sort of this regulatory arms are moving forward. So Washington, D.C. is sort of like, our voters regulated it. We're going forward. Congress, come and tell us we're wrong. But remember, the voters said this. So they're doing it. States and D.C. are doing it in a very democratic process. They're putting it to the voters, which is a brilliant way, because you're sort of like, well, the voters asked for it. The voters approved it. And I'm not talking approval like 50% plus one person. I'm talking like 60 and 70% approval ratings in terms of votes. So we're not talking about a small faction of weed heads supporting these issues. I'm talking about a large portion of the population that are voting these initiatives in. And the idea is like, well, this is a new funding stream. And as I mentioned earlier, politicians love money. They like to spend it. They love getting it. They want to figure out how to spend it. So they're not sort of going to give this up easily. Oregon is different in terms of Colorado and DC because Oregon regulated and legalized medicinal marijuana before legalizing it. So they have the regulatory apparatus in place. They literally just have to now convert some criminal laws to adhere to recreational use. And they're thinking about low taxes, because now they got to compete against Colorado at 27.9, and Washington State is moving around its sort of taxation. But they're talking about $35 per ounce. Now, if anybody cooks, think an ounce is very, very tiny. Because I'm not going to assume anybody deals drugs and actually has right, so let's think cooking. Small amounts. Know your audience. $35 is really a small, or on an ounce. An ounce is really a small amount of weight. And they're talking about $35 per ounce. You could literally be paying $70 for like 4 marijuana cigarettes. Taxes. And people seem perfectly acceptable with it. This is what legalization does. It's sort of like, well, if I don't have to go to the drug dealer, I don't have to get convicted, I don't have to have a felony conviction, I don't have to go to jail, sure, take my money in form of taxes. That is just fine. I can survive with that. So sort of to wrap this up, where are we? The financial issue is really what I think will prevent the federal government from doing anything. I think really what the whole argument of states is trying to overturn Schedule 1. How do we make the federal government change the law? How do we make them change the Controlled Substance Act of 1970 and change marijuana, maybe put it into Schedule 4 or even Schedule 3, so think Vicodin, Tylenol with codeine. If you can reduce the Schedule 1 to a lower schedule, I think Robitussin AC and marijuana will never be matched. But it could potentially be there with Ambien and Ativan and sort of drugs that are regularly prescribed. We think about sort of the use of pharmacies. We're already doing it with medicinal marijuana in several states. I think that will be the go-to. But then there's sort of all these extraneous costs that we're just learning about. So if you decriminalize or legalize, you're now eliminating the cost of arrests and jail and prosecution, which is a huge part of state budgets. It's just a huge part of state budgets to jail people. And if they don't have bail, they stay in jail, and that costs the city, the state, lots of money. So we literally could be collecting all these taxes, but reducing the cost of our criminal justice system. We could decrease the expenses associated with the incarceration and the judicial process for drug users, because in this country, we actually incarcerate drug addicts and users. We don't have a lot of treatment centers, so we incarcerate them. In Texas, I believe it's about $28,000 a year to incarcerate one person. Just sort of keep in mind. And then there's the revenue generation on the production, distribution, and sales of marijuana. So sort of in context, the country is now in a semi-legal, quasi-legal state of marijuana policy. Some states it's totally legal. Some states you can get a doctor's prescription. Some states they've decriminalized it. Don't go to the states that I mentioned earlier. Wyoming, if you're high, not possession, high, you can go to jail for 90 days. Just high, no possession. Secondhand smoke, very dangerous in marijuana, or in Wyoming in regards to marijuana. But the legalization movement, and this is where I really think things will not change, is there are ballot initiatives coming up in the presidential election 2016, November 2016, to legalize in California, which already has a regulatory system for medicinal. Massachusetts already has the regulatory system for medicinal. Arizona, Nevada, which also have medicinal legalization in place. So you're already looking at states Particularly, you think about Nevada in a swing state in a presidential election, which already has high turnout, and then generally young people will turn out for legalization of any mind-altering substance. The regulatory systems are already in place, which will make then legalization of small amounts easier. The federal government will be hard-pressed to come after this stream of income for states. They may do so. But the idea is the federal government, underneath the DEA and FBI, would have to expend a lot of resources to do so. And I'm not sure if the citizens of the United States would be willing to pay the $1 or $2 billion to overturn all these state medicinal grows, to literally arrest and incarcerate all these other individuals if the federal government tried to demolish the systems in place. So the goal of the states is to overturn Schedule 1. The current administration has literally said, okay, backing off. We're not going to do medicinal dispensaries raids anymore. So Obama had several raids, DEA raids, in his first term. And then once he was reelected, the DEA disappeared. The DEA could now focus more on cocaine and heroin and its introduction into the country. So you think about shifting from medicinal grows in the United States, shifting to an international perspective. And the idea is that marijuana could become just dead letter law. So it's on the books but not enforced, which then matters as to who's in the White House. But I don't think Republican or Democrat gets elected in 2016, they'll be able to overturn this rolling avalanche of institutions are already in place. And the biggest instance of that is the credit union in Colorado. If Colorado figures out how to collect money, audit businesses, other states will follow in the same path. And I think once the business angle and the money is regulated, the new institutional apparatus around the marijuana industry, the federal government won't be able to demolish unless it really blows up the rest of its federal budget. And I don't think politically they'll be able to do that. Anyways, thank you for your time. Are there any questions? Good afternoon.
I'm Michael Brunch, class of 73. Is this thing on?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I have two questions, actually. Because of the high taxes, has the black market persisted in places like Colorado? And number two, what impact does this have on employers who require employees to have drug tests?
I'll take the first question first. In terms of employers and drug tests, these individuals just aren't applying for jobs at those particular institutions. And drug tests in terms of drug use, in terms of employment and drug use, there are very defined employers that do so. So driving, taking care of children, taking care of the elderly, protected populations, but not a lot of institutions or companies are drug testing in regular jobs. There have to be that aspect of why would this be a bad thing. In terms of the black market, I'm not sure about Colorado. In Oregon, the prices have stayed the same, though they've just legalized it in terms of November, so it'll take a little while. In Washington, the prices, I understand, are still the same. And the sense is that a lot of people aren't sure if this new law is legal. So they'd rather, right, so think about that. They'd rather buy illegal weed and potentially be convicted of a felony because they're not quite sure if this whole thing is legalized and if the feds are gonna come down on the legal buys. Also, the black market, what they'll do is they'll create a different type of environment. So maybe marijuana decreases in terms of sales price, but now maybe the drug dealers start making deals on cocaine and marijuana or heroin and marijuana. They'll be doing package deals. And you laugh, but this happens. Drug dealers are marketers. They call drugs different names. They use different colored envelopes. They have stamps. They've this whole paradigm of marketing. Like some drug dealer went to university and got a marketing degree or understood his audience. But this whole idea of marketing, drug dealers do it. So they will just figure out a new way to do it. Also, in some states, the TCH level, so the drug in marijuana, is highly regulated. So if you have an internal grow and you want to increase your TCH levels, you can do what you need to do and cross-fertilize plants and make stronger marijuana or cannabis plants. And that might stay on the illegal market. That may not get into the regulated market. Yes?
I have two questions as well, actually. The first is, are there financial incentives for certain states to not legalize because of things from their criminal justice system, like people on the border of Colorado or states that get benefits from private prisons?
Great question. There's no financial incentive based on state competition. So Kansas would love Colorado to just sort of quit. Don't legalize, don't decriminalize. But Colorado's not listening to Kansas residents. There might be pressure on the other direction. So Kansas may be forced to figure something out if its states around it change.
They can fine people coming over the border.
They can, yes.
Financial incentive?
Depends if they're in-state or out-of-state. Because out-of-state people have the ability to then leave unless they're going to be detained. And you have to get them on Kansas law, like drunk driving, or possession. And I'm not sure if Kansas, particularly right now, has the money to invest in its state police force, just because of its own tax issues.
Sure. My second question is, interstate commerce becomes important when things start moving over the border. So you say the federal government will probably ignore state legalization, but for products moving over the border, they can't. So how soon does the federal government have to address this?
Right now, my understanding is there's no interstate issue, which the states are actually being very, very careful on doing, because then Congress, the president, DEA, FBI now have a national issue that they can then do interstate commerce. But the idea of Colorado creating its own credit union gets away from interstate commerce. The idea that Washington State has created its own regulatory system and not sharing resources with Oregon means that it's just in Washington State. So it's not an interstate issue yet. Where it will be is if people are selling items outside of state, and they don't do that yet. I think also the growers and the retail businesses don't want interstate issues to interfere in their businesses. It could be an issue, but anything could be an issue. Congress could surprise us and change the Schedule I determination.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Hi, John Shields, 85.
Hi.
Could you comment on what appears to be the leading U.S. Supreme Court case regarding the conflict between federal law and state law? That would be Gonzalez versus Reich, it's 2005. That was written by Stevens. All the Democrats were in favor of the federal government enforcing the schedule in California. Reich and Monson lived in California, and they were both using medical marijuana. They both got busted by the federal government.
Right.
Democrats on the Supreme Court said that is that's legal and that's all legit. The Republicans were against it. Somewhat of an interesting position. You had O'Connor, Rehnquist, and Thomas saying that we should allow the states to exercise their traditional police powers.
Yep.
Any thoughts on that case?
I'm not familiar with that exact Supreme Court case, and I'm trying to find my notes on the courts. The challenge with the court cases is that they found the two individuals guilty, but California did not change its laws. And my sense is since 2005, the federal government has really backed off of doing these sort of dispensary, like not invading. raiding, thank you, raiding medical dispensaries. They have decreased doing so. And sort of there's other cases floating around in Washington state about this very issue of if you've got medicinal marijuana, it's legal in your state, but the federal government comes after you. States are doing interesting things and providing legal support for those individuals so they can uphold their state law. In terms of that Supreme Court case applicable, it is still true. It's now law. Like, states should, or individuals should not be violating the federal law. But states, by not following the federal law, not enforcing the federal law, are basically daring the federal government to come after them. And I'm not sure if the federal government has the resources or willing to pay the amount of money to go after all these individual businesses, dispensaries, in the way that it was acceptable in 2005. That's my sense. There's just so many now. The federal government could spend years in court and not accomplish anything. Yes?
Gentlemen, just one quick question. With everything you said about marijuana today, do you think there'd be any possibility of the legalization of heroin and cocaine, or is that just too complicated?
It's
Let's just because this is because human nature being human nature, people, do use cocaine, they do use heroin, no matter how bad or harmful the products might be. But nevertheless, we end up by sending money to drug networks and cartels and drug traffickers, and that would be my argument to somehow injure or dismantle the global narcotics network.
Yeah, I don't see the legalization of heroin and cocaine taking place. Part of the argument against marijuana in the early 70s was that it was a gateway drug, that a lot of people are going to smoke weed and then they're going to do coke. And that did not actually happen. What people did was LSD. So they were combining marijuana with something else, but it wasn't cocaine and heroin. It was a different drug. So often studies show that marijuana is sort of the endpoint for the majority of users, the large majority of users. And cocaine and heroin is a dicey issue, and we have to figure out the pharmaceuticals, because most people that are addicted to heroin and cocaine, they go there after an injury, and after they've been OxyContin, and they can't get the $60 pill, but they can get the $5 bag of heroin. So it's usually, we don't do a good job with our pharmaceutical control of regulated drugs and prescribed by the doctor. And I always put quotation marks, prescribed by the doctor, because people can abuse those legal drugs too. If we haven't quite figured out how to stop that, but a lot of the addiction starts with a health issue. And so until I think we figure that out, heroin and cocaine will never be on the agenda. And then the second reason why it won't be on agenda, because it just makes people really scared. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great afternoon.